So I think the tension there, Randy, is that the purpose of the biological opinions and the RPAs is to avoid jeopardy of the species, and everybody recognizes that. And right now, many of the actions for avoiding jeopardy cost water. And so what the contractors are interested in is using the science process to find ways to continue to provide protection against jeopardy while being more efficient in water use, while being able to free up supplies, get more reliability out of the system. That's fine. That's perfectly legitimate. That's what science should be doing. The environmental organizations, their fear is that the RPAs, the actions, are going to be weakened in the process. And so they're looking for the best science. I don't think they have any disagreement about increasing water supply reliability as long as the objectives of the RPAs are met. Avoid the jeopardy. And if you can improve avoiding jeopardy, being more protective of the species while giving more water supply through this process, then fine, let's do that. And so I think that's where we are really working. What places a lot of tension on this is the current conditions we have today, the drought. I mean, there's always tension. The drought just adds some more of that. And then the time frame. From what I've heard, the contractors are more insistent. We've got to find this stuff out quickly. We can't spend 3, 5, 10, 15 years working on a process to get these answers, which help us out. And so, again, that's another source of tension, is the time frame. How quickly can we learn? And, as I said, science is a learning process. So, and the environmental organizations are going to want to make sure that these RPAs are not weakened just for water supply reliability, that they, in fact, continue to provide protection for the species, the avoidance of jeopardy. And unfortunately, the scientists sit in the middle. So we have to provide room, space, effort, time, resources to allow them to work and not expect miracles.
Yes. You are operating now under the constraints of a court order. That's
yes.
The context. Well, let's assume there was no court order. It disappears. Would this process continue, and could you reach that collaborative result that you've talked about? Would you be willing to do that?
Well, I have a particularly hazy crystal ball, but when we did submit to the court, as you know, there was then an additional ruling by the Ninth Circuit. And so right now, folks are thinking a lot about that. And I'm really happy to say that every member of CAMP has reaffirmed their commitment to collaborative science and building this framework of working together and doing joint fact-finding. Perhaps the schedule would change, but I think the process will continue because everyone sees value in it.
Do you share those comments?
I do. I think the court order really forces the issue. So the court order provides a deadline, and it provides a court order. A collaborative science process, regardless of whether you have a court order or not, is necessary for all of us to succeed in terms of achieving our interests. It's necessary, but when you have other important venues taking place, like figuring out how to work out the drought, figuring out how to stop fish from going into a certain slough or channel, working on BDCP, working on the California Water Plan, it all takes away resources from a good process, a collaborative science process. And as I said, if you take away those resources, unless you can dedicate them and keep them there, and it's just not going to work. You keep putting it off. And you do need schedules.
You would hold this, I mean, as I understand the comments, you would hope you could hold to this schedule. It may slip a little bit, but leaving the court order aside, but you would still continue the process. That's what I'm interested in.
Yes.
I am in favor of Dr. Connor, I'm in favor of drafting you and Leo Winternitz into the National Guard, activating you for full-time service, locking you in a room, and having you become, and your colleagues on this committee, the first test of adaptive management in California, self-declared. Now, that would be terrible for you two, but it would probably be good for the state of California. The thing that strikes me that's most interesting is not that science's role in water supply or ecosystems are doubted. I mean, 2 years ago, Governor Brown and Secretary Salazar held their big press conference, and, they said science will guide habitat restoration and water system operations. But I think Leo, you've correctly pointed out that basically everybody wants to make sure that their prior determined positions get the best possible deal before allowing that process to be fully implemented. And of course, Judge Damrell pointed out I think the most interesting part of what you're doing. You've got a judge involved in a specific case where for all the delay that's gone on, it's been years and years and years of litigating over the BIOPS decision, there will come a point when Judge O'Neill will start making orders, will understand what the Circuit Court of Appeals decision, the most recent one, means, and there'll probably be orders on operational conditions. My concern is I want to see the kind of collaborative scientific involvement ready to go and part of that process. A lot of the participants, both water agencies and environmental groups, have said the BIOP stuff is not the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, but at least the notion of adaptive management is something that is already a part of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, and everybody says they want it, but nobody can point to a specific example that says, here's an adaptive management system up, running, and so on. Tell me how we get to that point. I mean, this to me is an opportunity so ripe with potentials for benefit. And at least on paper, you've got everybody saying, oh yeah, science got to be involved, really important. What does it take to take the next step? And the only question, Dr. Connor, I have is, as best I can tell from this timeline, to get to the point, the next step is interim operations, which means you're going to have an interim, I think, an interim structure, methodology, approach ready to go in short order. Shortest 2 years, longest 5 years. Something tells me it's got. If you had to do it tomorrow, what would you do? I mean, that to me is the most important thing, is to start somewhere and say something and say, this is, for lack of perfect definition, this is the way science ought to be involved. And then start the damn thing. Now, I'm in favor of that because I don't know how we can get over this mutual distrust that permeates the water world. I don't know how we can get over the reluctance of government agencies to ever talk about an effective way of resolving the differences between agencies that we all know about and the council heard about yesterday in some of Delta restoration projects, unless you start just doing things. Now, that of course puts scientists and scientific advisors like Leo at risk for getting yelled at. But I'm in favor of creating that circumstance. How do we get there?
He's in favor of yelling.
I would say that I've been yelled at more times in the last 9 months than in my prior 56 years. So you do have to have tough skin. But I mean, what we're trying to do is build the relationships, the collaborative thing, because you can't court mandate collaboration. It's something internal. It's a passion and it's a commitment. And I think we have now achieved that at the level of the camp. Now what we're really focused on is we have the adaptive management cycle that's included in the Delta Science Plan. And so we are at that point where we're defining problems and laying out our conceptual models. And so we're marching around that circle. Part of our problem is different folks think we're at different places on that circle. But that's what we are trying to do. And regardless of what happens with court decisions, the reasonable and prudent action on fall outflow, fall habitat, is an adaptive management plan. Mm-hmm. And so we can continue to work on that together, and we will.
So just a quick response, Mr. Eisenberg. What you want to see happen, I think, is in reality evolving, slowly happening. I think as you
glaciers are melting also, Leo.
They are, but things don't just be created because we want them to happen. It's scientists are people. They also need to learn to work with each other. That's why Bell mentioned, that part of our initial meetings were sitting in a room, getting to know each other, and learning that we can trust each other, and figuring out which scientists really work best with whom, and getting them together in a room, looking at the conceptual models, defining the disagreements, and understanding why there are disagreements, and then figuring out on how to close any gaps that there are. That's the process. It takes time. And CAMP is, I don't know if it's a baby step. It's a step towards that process that you want, the one Delta, one science, a collaborative process where we can all work together. My biggest fear is that if CAMP fails, for whatever reason, then I fear we'll have taken a huge step backwards. Because if CAMP fails, given everybody's expectations and the need and the want for it to succeed and the resources dedicated to it, if it fails, I don't know what the alternative is. I think you'd have to go back to your Delta Science folk and say, okay, what have we learned from this, and what should we be doing differently?
The thing that lawyers involved in litigation from all parties and water system managers have always said is that the timeline for operational decisions to protect species, to guarantee a reliable water supply, whatever, are so short that careful, deliberative, scientific exploration can never meet those time frames. You've obviously talked about that. Both of you have worked on that particular issue. As this camp structure slowly emerges, what's the chance of simultaneously having the more traditional longer range research evaluation and all that? And secondly, an informed, what do we call it now, best available science, not the perfect science, but the best available science, out of a body of independent scientists, including stakeholder input on this kind of stuff, so that somebody can just say, well, don't tell me 4 years from now, tell me 3 months from now when we have to make our operational changes. That, to me, is one of the more important ingredients to jump one of the hurdles, which is the reluctance of lawyer litigants and water system operators to accepting a scientific involvement. It's the ability to respond both in short order and in the long run.
I think there's a greater opportunity for managers and policy people to accept a, quote, best available science within whatever time frame if that best available science came from a collaborative scientific body that represented different interests.
Leo, how do you prevent the fact that there are always people out there who want to negotiate the scientific process and conclusions for whatever position they have? And scientists generally prefer to get in the room yourself, kick it around, yell at each other, argue about it, look at things and evaluate it and come back with the questions you need to have answered in short order, and the answers get developed somehow. I mean, you can't wait for the outside world to say, yes, we're completely willing to surrender all of our preferences to some mythical scientific order. How do you get past that?
I think you recognize, so whatever best available science comes up, there's always going to be uncertainty, right? So I think what the scientists are responsible for in that sense is expressing what that uncertainty is so that it can be understood by the policy folk. That's their job. That's what they're going to have to try and do. Recognize the differences, figure out how to close the gap in the differences, but also be able to explain to the policy folk what those uncertainties are. And then it becomes really a policy decision on how to use that information. I don't know if that answers your question.
In my experience, everybody says they want science to guide, as long as that science backs up their particular ideas. They get a little bit miffed when the science doesn't go their way. The part that I find that may be the rock that water has crashed on every time is right now we're in a drought. And several times we've had folks come here and talk to us. And I wonder, I look at them and I go, I'm just incredulous, because they'll be saying that they're starting the planning and they're starting this, and I'm going, this isn't the first drought. We shouldn't be having to go back there and pull these teams together to figure it out. To me, we've had more than enough time to figure out this, and the scary part is that if you have this whole collaborative effort and you do bring us this perfect thing, and we go into a long-term drought, and there's not enough water, you're going to this thing breaks up, because you then start fighting over this shrinking pie. And when that thing shrivels up, that's the scary part, because then you go into the emergency, and then somebody, the great all-powerful Oz, decides what's going to happen with the little bit of water we have left. And I don't know how you deal with that from your perspective.
The great Oz is real.
You could only hope so much. There's no real question. It's just,
Let me.
you have a tough thing to do.
Again, and maybe I'll be doing this for the next 2-3 years, caution the policy people. The scientists will bring you the information, and they'll bring you the best available information that they have. It's up to you guys to decide how to use it. What the scientists need to do is define, again, what the uncertainties are. And you use that in making your policy decisions. In the case of limited water supplies, we still have co-equal objectives, right? One thing I find myself questioning myself is if co-equal objectives are very co-equal and truly co-equal, then why are some water folk looking for a relaxation of standards in a drought year? If they're truly co-equal, they should apply for very wet years and very dry years. It's not we will practice co-equality when it's convenient to do so. So that's beyond the scope of this. But that becomes a policy decision. So the scientists, they've been trained, they'll resolve differences, they'll look for ways to provide not necessarily answers, but information. And then, the policy people have to use that, make their decisions.
The difference that I see with the camped process is that there have been these issues that have been sucking the air out of the room. And the scientific discussion has had folks, mostly attorneys, arguing about that science. And what we're trying to do is look at those issues as scientists and define where we agree and where we disagree, and then jointly design the study to help address that. And so if everybody agrees this is the question and this is a legitimate approach and this is how we envision conducting this study and then assessing the results that come back, you've reduced the disagreements that are associated with it at that time. When the results come out, people may interpret it differently, and that's always going to be the case. But again, if you look at the vision of the science plan of One Delta, One Science, if we develop this together, so there's this shared body of knowledge on agreements and disagreements, I think it makes it much easier for policymakers and decision makers to get the whole picture and to understand it instead of just hearing what their particular agency or contractor or NGO is saying about the data.
You're to follow up on those comments, and collectively, I think we're all kind of talking about the same thing. Your success is profoundly important, because if it doesn't succeed, judges and lawyers are going to be involved. You want to put judges and lawyers out of business. They shouldn't be the ones making the decisions in this matter. You should be the leaders. Not to say that you're going to make the decisions, but it's your common understanding of the reality we're dealing with that's going to drive the policymakers. It shouldn't be judges picking up the pieces afterwards. I really hope that you are as successful as your first comments indicated, that your hope would be that this could be successful. And if it's not, we have lots of problems that extend far beyond this discussion today. So I wish you the best of luck and I hope that you do succeed and stay with it.
Thank you.
Let me piggyback on that. For each one of you, how will you know when you're far enough along to implement something? How will you know when the process is good enough to apply?
I'm not sure if you're talking about when you think we'll know enough in terms of the science. Is that what you're asking?
Yes. When there is a dispute that currently is in the court, and there's this tension between wanting to extract more water through the delta and protecting the species, you're developing an adaptive management program. When will that adaptive management program be to the point where the collaborative process says, this is good enough, let's go? How will you know? How will you know you've reached that point?
I don't know if any of the scientists will ever say, this is good enough, let's go. I think what you'll hear is, this is what we know today. This is the best available science. We have to go with it. If people are not happy with it, policymakers, we will continue working on it. And they would anyhow, because they're scientists. They know that their knowledge is not perfect, and so they're always trying to improve. The question is, how fast? How many resources are dedicated to improving upon that knowledge that they already know? And that becomes really the management issue. And so how many resources you place and how committed you are to doing that. But it doesn't end. It's right. Going to be continuous learning, and that's all part of the adaptive management cycle.
As long as the delta is changing, we have to continue adaptively managing. And we don't expect the delta to stop changing anytime soon.
And the delta is being managed now, most of the time based on the science that's available. So I think the management doesn't stop either. It just gets adjusted and improved. And I think with the science evolving over time and our knowledge improving, the the question about evaluating trade-offs between different values in the policy realm just gets honed better and better. The trade-offs become more and more apparent, and you can quantify them better. And then that's what makes it easier for the policymakers to weigh things. And I think that's where what Leo was saying earlier about where the science stops and the policy begins. It's the evaluation of trade-offs and choosing how to balance that best.
The best you can hope for, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Is to bring scientists representing different interest groups together and work together, which is what's happening in CAP, and have them issue their findings on specific subjects. And that's really what ultimately you're looking for. Their work defined within a scope of guidelines and principles, which is what the Delta Science Program has established.
Lauren, you
I
wanted
was
to say something.
just going to point out that I think we're doing it now. I think every time there's a decision made by a regulatory body or a management body, whether it's on ESA issues like biological opinions or whether it's the state board, they're working right now and they're making decisions now on best available science. And so I think this process is just trying to find a different way to put together the best available science so that we have less, hopefully, litigation around the science because of the way in which it was pulled together. But we're doing it right now, so I don't think, Randy, we need to wait, and we don't to go, oh, now it's ready.
It's always ready.
It is ready. We're doing it now. We're doing, in a certain form, adaptive management now, whether people recognize it or not. We're just trying to propose better ways to do it, more aware, I guess, ways of doing it. And the scientists are always doing what they can do in terms of improving the state of knowledge, but adaptive management really involves the managers and policymakers, and they've got to play their part, too, in doing adaptive management and also in allowing for, as best they can, the big experiments that would help us improve knowledge faster.
I've said this a number of times in public speeches and even in writing and talked to state officials about it. It would add a sense of reality to what you're doing if everyone would just decide to take projects that are already underway. For example, the South Yolo project, Dr. Connor, I think you were even here during our discussion almost a year ago on South Yolo briefing by the water contractors. Mm-hmm. And that led Dr. Goodwin to interject at the time it was coming up, well, just from the Delta Plan's viewpoint, you can't look at South Yolo standing alone. You have to look at Liberty Island, McCormick Williamson, the connection to the Meadows and the connection to Consumnes River Preserve, almost a string of stuff if you want to comply with the statutory mandate, our statutory mandate, for interconnected habitat of great value. It was just one of those episodes where a scientific perspective gave reality. Now, personally, and I suggested this to state officials, everybody knows we're going to do some version of the South Yolo project. The question is only when. The contractors own the property. They've offered to pay the money to satisfy the existing biological opinions, whatever credit they get or don't get on a Bay Delta conservation plan. That ought to be part of what you're doing. You should have focus on habitat restoration, some water reliability actions, modest, as part of the package, because there's nothing quite like bringing programs that are underway and for which funding is available into a setting where the scientific opinions can sandpaper them, shape them, adjust them, and modify them. And you have at least the advantage of a court behind it with a legal obligation to make decisions on the biological opinions. And I know this is nothing you guys can control, but it's always seemed to me that we spend all of our time talking about on every side, habitat restoration, water development, everything else, because nobody's prepared to give any tactical advantage until they get everything they want on something larger. And I just think that your work could be a prototype for a more successful form of water management and ecosystem management for 30, 40, 50, 60 years to come. And they ought to just essentially use what you're doing with some project additions at the same time, modest project additions, because that would focus everybody's attention. It would also give you a sense of actually having your hands around something you could make a contribution on, and I think would be extraordinarily valuable.
The 4 areas that the camp identified as high priority, the 4th one was restoration and looking at the effectiveness of restoration.
But that was removed from
We
the list.
put it on the back burner for the reason that the other 3 issues that we're focused on, there's religious beliefs associated with the continuum of the science there. And we really did need to make sure that we didn't kick the can down the road and that we addressed those. But the camp didn't remove restoration from the list of issues. It just said it's what Leo was saying about time and resources. We didn't want to do a bunch of C work on a number of different topics. We wanted to try and do A work on the priority. So I don't disagree with you. And I also don't disagree that if you take an area like restoration, where we don't yet have a holy war, it's much easier to build that trust and to go forward. And so it would have been nice if we could have started with an issue like that.
Well, if the state and federal agencies want to delay the implementation of the biological opinions for a set period of time, and they went in this last go-around and said, let's do another 3 years to develop an adaptive management, looks a whole lot better if they're doing a balanced water reliability, habitat restoration, small at the same time. That's just, that's out there. And I agree with you that religious beliefs, shorthand for long-established traditional positions, are hard to negotiate in the abstract, maybe impossible. But some operational stuff would be helpful. Anyway, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Connor and Leo, for doing this. It is not totally thankless, but it is hard, difficult work in a political context. And I just think you're doing a terrific job, and I congratulate you and our science folks for sticking with it.
Any other council members wish to weigh in? Got Peter and then Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't resist just making a couple of comments based on that discussion. I was really reminded by the quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who said, the great thing about science is it's true whether or not you believe in it. And I think that a lot of what CAMT has been doing, this idea of collaboratively building a common body of knowledge, and many of the mechanisms that you've been using, of course, it was developed and thought about at the same time as the science program, the science plan. But the beauty of what you're doing is it's allowing this early road testing of many of the concepts in there. And of course, yesterday you heard about 3 of these mechanisms which we have in place to establish this common body of knowledge. But most of all, I just wanted to say the journey that CAMT has been through in the last 12 months. I think it's fair to say there was incredible skepticism at the start of that process, and I think it's really a testament to both Val and Leo as individuals and their stature in the science community that they've actually been able to pull this off. And I think what you managed to do in 12 months was just a remarkable achievement. So from the science community perspective, thanks, and let's see lots more of it.
Thank you. Yeah, there were many involved. It isn't just Val and Leo.
I guess my question over the science program's involvement in the camp was in part sparked by our council members saying, hey, prove your value. Let's get involved here. And you guys have talked kind of generally about it. And we were able to devote considerable time to the camp process, but it did require 3 of our top leaders, both Lauren and Reiner as well as Anka, being involved in ways that took them away from other things that are also been long-term priorities for many folks. I wish you could tell us a little bit about, had the science program not been involved, how would things have been different? I mean, you could have pulled the science plan off the shelf and it would have said, oh, try this, try that. It's not like the adaptive management cycle that's being employed is novel. It's, well accepted now, and people have been talking about it for a dozen plus years in my experience. So where did our science program staff make a difference and how? I mean, partly that would justify continued involvement, but partly it would also help us understand when else that sort of activity might be useful.
They've been integral since the beginning, and it's because of the skills, knowledge, and expertise that the three individuals actually have brought to the process. They've participated on the camp, but also on these science teams. But they really have provided guidance on process. How should we do this? If our goals are legitimacy, credibility, and relevance, what should our guidelines be? And they took a real leadership role in laying that out for the camp to consider and ultimately adopt and submit to the court. It's really a challenge, though, now to take that guidance and put it into place. And so I would say that the level of commitment we're hoping can continue and actually expand so that their involvement in the camp and these scoping teams is essential. But as we get to these areas where we agree to disagree, we do really want to capitalize on other things that are in the science plan and other folks that are in the science program in terms of conflict management, assessment, and communication of findings. So I'm here to ask for not only continued support, but expanded support. That's going to help us with what Leo was saying in terms of time and resources.
From the NGO community perspective, it was essential that Delta Science Program staff participate. It provided just a sense of, I wasn't going to do this, I'll use a religious thing. It's like you go to Mass on Sunday, and instead of the priest, the bishop comes in to say Mass, that kind of a feeling. So it provided a...
You're a bishop now.
No, Reiner's the bishop.
Provided a sense
About
that...
time.
Anyhow, but it was essential for the NGO community that Delta Science Program be involved, in particular because of the objective, the one science. Again, it's that honest broker, not that anybody is among the scientists were dishonest, but it's an entity not representing a special interest that was in the room. And an entity that was fully versed and were experts on the science process. And that's truly where the value came in.
I think the public water agencies share everything you just said, though.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other comments or questions? Reiner, any final comments?
Bishop?
I'm okay, thanks.
I can't help but wonder what that makes the lead scientist in the program.
Cardinal. Yeah, right.
But Val, Leo, thank you very much for your leadership, and thank you for the good words about the Delta Science Program. We appreciate the relationship. Yesterday, we skipped a portion of the executive officer's report because of the concurrent Senate Finance Committee hearing. Dan Ray was absent then.